Thanks very much, and thanks to Sportico for, among other things, allowing us to have a fantastic reunion. You know, it was 25 years ago, literally this week, that the four of us were joined at the hip, getting ready for the launch of something that many people have said was really an inflection point in the development of the world of sports media. You know, I want to just for a moment say that, you know, Jed, to my right here, 36 years at ESPN now, very active working with technology companies throughout the industry. Jerry Gepner here to my right, at that time when we left to start Sportvision, he had been the head of field operations, all remote production at Fox Sports. And Stan, to my far right, head of technology at News Corp at that time, and the head of Stan Honey Navigation, the holder of world records for sailing, one of the, if not the leading navigator in the world, and still a major consultant on technology in the industry. So, you know, it was literally the end of 1997, the beginning of 1998, when Jerry, Stan, and I left News Corp to start Sportvision. And on our list at that time, as part of our product conception, were a number of things which we needed in order to get funding for the company. But one of them was an electronic first down line for football broadcasts. And Stan, maybe you want to kick things off and talk a little bit about how that product or that technology came to be on the list when we left News Corp and started the company.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to start with a broad observation, which is, in I think all of our experience, really important things can happen when you have a group of people that bring to it diverse sets of skills. And I think this group of the four of us is a great representation of that. You know, I'm the technical development guy. Jed knows what are the important stories and how to tell them in sport. Jerry knows how to get stuff into a broadcast and field operations, and then Bill could figure out how to pay for the darn thing and get it to work. And that's part of, you know, the story I'm about to tell is kind of an example of that it's this diversity of folks with diverse backgrounds and diverse skills working together where, you know, magic things happen. So what I ended up with a kind of a quirky background. I'm a professional engineer. I worked at SRI doing, you know, aerospace, military stuff, but I had an unusual undergraduate education in a liberal arts college, so I could explain stuff pretty well. And so when I sold my first company, which is a vehicle navigation company, to News Corporation, the other CEOs realized that I could explain things. And so it wasn't long before I got promoted to be CTO, not because it was a development job, but because I could explain technology. On the other hand, that drove me crazy, so I created it. I turned it into a bit of a development job. But one of the things that happened was David Hill, who founded Fox Sports and has been, you know, had a large effect on sports broadcast through the years. But David asked me to have a meeting with him once a week, have lunch with him, and tell him something that technology could do that could affect sports broadcast that wasn't being done. So every week we would have this fabulous lunch, and of course lunches with David Hill are always amusing. But at one of these lunches I told David that it was just barely technically possible, and this is about 94. It was just barely technically possible to compute graphics fast enough so that you could do a very simple graphic at field rate, 60 fields per second, and position it correctly over the video of the real world. So you could correctly position it relative to the background of the real world. And it had never been done, that it was just becoming possible. And David asked for an example, and I said, well, you know, you could put in a fake billboard or something. And then David went on to tell me something that he and Jed have both told me many, many times over my career, which is, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But that's where the creative part of the conversation happens, because they say that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, but could you do this other thing? And I say, well, we couldn't do that, but we could do this. And they say, well, that's better still, and then you're off. And then what comes out of that conversation is something that has benefited from Jed and David's knowledge of what's important for sports, and then my background where I had a good ability to estimate and explain what was possible to do. So out of that conversation with David, he said, well, could you track and highlight a hockey puck? And I said, well, yeah, we could do it. And I've tracked much more difficult things at SRI, my first job, but you couldn't afford it. And David explained to me, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Of course we can afford it. This is broadcast sports. So he asked me to do a quote, and one thing led to another. And then that was the development of the original Foxtrax hockey puck, which we started development of in '94, and we introduced it in '96. And that was through a news technology group, which is a group that I pulled together at News Corp so that I could maintain my sanity. I could continue to build stuff and not just talk about technology. And then in the discussions that took place during the development of the hockey puck, that's when the concept first came around for the yellow line, that we got to talking about other sports. And I came up for David and gave him a few examples of what we could do in football. And David, again, explained that that was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. But if you could do that stuff, could you just do a first down line? And I say, well, yeah, that'd be easier still. And that was where the original concept came about. But then those discussions took place, I think, probably 15 or 20 times more with Jed. And all of the detailed decisions about exactly how it had to appear. And when it was first introduced, it was Jed's brilliance to introduce it with a very soft alpha, transparent, exactly the same shade as the yellow chalk that we all have dealt with in high school sports. And so it really did look like it was on the field. Whereas today, it's clearly an electronic representation, but it was really Jed's brilliance to make it look like it was actually on the grass.
Right. But the one thing I will take issue with you was you used the word easy. And all of you out there may have picked up on that. There was really nothing easy or, in fact, deadline friendly in making this work, because we started the company at the beginning of 1998, and we looked at our list and we decided that this was the first product we wanted to pursue. But of course, nobody had ever done it, and we needed to present it to the broadcast networks, and so we created a simulation tape. That is, we didn't actually invent the technology. We created a simulation to show what we planned to do if someone agreed to pay us a whole bunch of money. And the challenge with that, of course, was we were telling somebody we could do something we hadn't done. And maybe I'll turn this over to you, Jerry, because actually doing it and integrating it into a live broadcast environment, not only had never been done, was a pretty frightening thing. But you were comfortable that we could show this simulation tape and make it happen.
Comfortable?
Yeah, well.
Yeah, I think probably the hardest part of my job, once we had the basic technology working, we had this truck with all the computers, was convincing Jed's production team that they wouldn't go off the air if it didn't work. Freddie and Drew, was their biggest concern, is when we went to air with this, if something went wrong, did we go to black? Right? But
It's actually Mark Payton.
was it? It was Mark. That's right. Yeah,
Pre-Drew.
it was pre-Drew, but it was Freddie. And the idea of creating a simulation, we actually put it together at a post-production house here in the city, and it was a complete simulation of what we thought it might look like. Right? It wasn't the right color yellow. It wasn't any of those things, but it got the idea across, and that's what we used to pitch to the networks and to present to the leagues and anybody that would listen.
Right. And ESPN at the time had Sunday Night Football. We went, of course, to our friends at Fox. We had just left News Corp, and Stan had worked very closely with David Hill, who ran Fox Sports. We all knew David very well, so of course we went first to Fox. And believe it or not, they turned us down. And then we went to ABC, which had Monday Night Football. and they wanted to think about it for a while. And then we went to CBS, and they weren't sure. So all of this that seems so obvious today, that who would ever want to watch a football game without a first down line, the 3 networks other than ESPN turned it down. And we then set up a meeting in Bristol, which at that time had about 2 or 3 buildings, not the campus that you all know today. And Jed put his team together, and Jerry and I went up there to show simulation. And we were holding our breath. Of course, we didn't tell Jed that we had already been turned down by the other 3 networks. But we were keeping our fingers crossed that this might work. And Jerry went through it all and showed the simulation. And then I'm going to turn it over to Jed, because then the lights turned back on, and the visionary that he is suddenly changed the world.
Well, maybe the football world, but yeah, we were the last chance Charlies on this deal, and we had no idea. We thought these guys were coming into Bristol, and like we'd come of age, and this is like they're gonna sell us this cool thing because we're cooler than all the other networks. No, we were last chance, and but we didn't know that, and that's fine. But I think one of the reasons, and you're very kind to say all those things about us, but it was more about the culture of ESPN, because up until that point, we were the little engine that could, and that's how we envisioned ourselves at ESPN. I mean, it may seem hard to think of us 25 years ago. I still use us as a pronoun because I'm sort of in my DNA. But the point was that we were willing to take risks. That was part of what ESPN did. We were always risk takers. We realized there'd be enormous reward with enormous chances of failure. And one of the things about what we were doing that was so important was this was not just a little nice addition to an NFL telecast. This was something that was going to be seen on every play and every shot of every NFL game that we televised. I mean, the risk was enormous, plus the fact the NFL had no idea what we were up to and didn't know until we had already invested $1 million, and we were 4 months into it. And we finally got Paul Tagliabue in front of it, and he finally said, "It's a good idea, keep going." Okay, we'll keep going. And we did, but of course, the problem was, because this is just so easy to do, we had a 7-month run-up to the damn thing. And we were in Kansas City for the final preseason game, and the line is still doing this. And I walk out of the truck, Stan, and I'm like, nope, ain't gonna work. We're not going to air with it. And we, of course, had intended to go air on the first regular season game. Let the record reflect, the first launch was September 28th, which would have meant the 3rd week. But we did it, and we did it with great angst. But when we did do it, it proved to be that it was worth that risk, and that we were smart enough to work with folks like this, who we believed in. And when you do that kind of risk-reward calculation, it's a real big risk, but it was an enormous reward. And these guys are the ones that should be taking the credit for it.
Yeah, a couple of technical observations. From my standpoint, after having done the puck, and of course the puck was controversial as heck, but after having done the puck, the additional development to get the yellow line work was the hockey field of play has a virtue that it tends to be quite flat. Football fields of play have very distinct and unusual crown. So we had to accurately measure that and model it so that the yellow line would curve exactly the same way that the real lines curve due to the crown of the field. And we had to key the line under the athletes so that it appeared as though the athletes were going over it. Whereas in hockey, we didn't bother. The hockey, the red rocket trail was on top of everything. And so those were the 2 jobs that worried me the most. We had a very good guy, J.R. Glaudemans, who came up with a scheme early on that provided me quite a bit of comfort that we were going to get the keying problem solved. And then the other problems were all just engineering work, and I knew that we were going to solve them. And then Jed and I, as it happens, knew each other through sailing and through Susie. And so Jed calls me up, and Jed can communicate very clearly when he chooses to. And Jed asked the question, how do I know you're going to get this thing to work? And so we had a mutual friend that was working for Jed at the time, Alan Trimble, and I said, send AT out, have him spend a week with our team, and then ask him. And I think what AT told Jed was, these guys are gonna get it to work. It may be late, So your decision is whether you want the Emmy or not. And Jed decided to go for it. But that was the sort of the big technical threshold. And then that jitter that Jed talks about, you know, every one of us on my technical team will never forget exactly what that problem was. And it just drove us crazy. But you'd operate the system and it would work perfectly, and then as time went on, it would start to jitter a little more, and then you'd try something else, and you'd restart the system, and the jitter would go away, and then it would slowly come back, and it just drove us crazy. And it was a huge credit to Jed that Jed had this quality sense of it has to be perfect. And Jed kept sending us back. And then we finally took the truck back to California and spent a couple of weeks on it, and we finally nailed the problem. And to anybody here who's ever done coding, it was just, you know, the sort of bang your head against the wall problem. But we were using a float to measure time. And the resolution of superimposing video on the real world has such a great demand that it needed to be a double. And so what was happening is the longer the system ran, the less resolution there was in time. And then eventually you'd start to see the jitter. And all of us had read that code, you know, hundreds of times, and we hadn't seen that blunder. And then when we finally found it, we'll never forget that feeling, and it just nailed the problem. And then Jed said, the next game, take Sportvision filthy to air.
Yeah, it was filthy because, as those of you who do broadcast know, there's clean, there's dirty, and then we needed a new level because the entire show had to be run through their systems. And Doug Dodson, God rest his soul, was the tech manager, and he said, well, guess we're going to call it filthy. Okay, that's it, take filthy. And it was a filthy business. But interestingly, the truck that you mentioned, it bears sort of emphasis on how much of a moonshot this was, in the sense that when they say the truck, it was a full semi, loaded with nothing but computer racks. Now it's probably a couple of laptops, but just the enormity of what was achievable then required a mobile unit with nothing but racks. And just for context, and I've said this before, the iPod, not phone, the iPod came out 4 years after we launched First and 10. So that's where we were in the technological timeline.
Yeah, and when I mentioned that it was just barely technically possible, this is back in the days of standard def. And with a rack of the most powerful SGI computers, you could just barely get the graphics computed and the keying computed in time, so that, you know, 60 fields per second were ready to go. And the computers that we had to use, these most powerful SGI computers, were not, as it turns out, designed to survive the environment of being driven around in a truck every week. And so every week we'd turn the system on and it wouldn't work. And every week we had to fix the computer, take all the boards out, clean all the contacts, put it all back in. And every week we managed to get it to work. But in those days, it was a full 55-foot old CBS truck.
Yeah, it was a 48-footer.
Yeah, full of gear and a crew of 7. And now it's a, you know, foot-high rack.
Yeah, I mean, it's inconceivable to think, when we all carry computers around in our pockets, that it took us in that first year an entire 48-foot semi to have enough computing power to insert that line in real time and allow the broadcast to go on that way. And, you know, one of the things that's really not well known is that we weren't shooting to launch this the third week of the season. I mean, our goal was to hit the beginning of the season. But as Stan said, at that dress rehearsal the week before, there was still that jitter, and to, you know, ESPN's credit and Jed's credit, they wanted it to be perfect, and it was the right call.
The other thing, you may remember this, Stan, the delay that we had to put in to make the computed image line up with the camera image in today's world would be just insanity. It was 7 seconds, right? Was the delay, and we were very proud of ourselves that we got it down to 7 seconds. Today, if it's 7 frames, there's people screaming and yelling, but it was 7 seconds of delay between what was coming out of the production truck and then what was coming out of our truck.
Oh, and that caused a couple of hilarious situations that I'm sure Jed remembers. But because the filthy was so far delayed, you couldn't allow it to be sent around the compound because it would drive people crazy. So then the commentators at first couldn't see the filthy, so they couldn't see the yellow line. So every now and then there'd be a real close spot. And the commentators would be saying, well, do you think he's got it? And the people at home are saying, of course he has it, you moron. And so then what they did is they put the, I guess, net return on a little teeny monitor up high, and you'd see the commentators occasionally start to look up and see whether they had the first down or not.
Right, which gets to what the NFL required us in that first season. I don't know if, Jed, you remember, but it had to do with the width of the line and how we had to pull it out. Remember that?
Well, I mean, the short of it was the NFL was the gold standard, is the gold standards, and will always be. And the short of it is that they weren't going to let us put anything on their field that they did not feel was working. So it was a very short leash on the level of acceptability. I do remember there was a major press conference. Steve Bornstein was the president of ESPN at the time. And he had scheduled a major press conference here in New York with the NFL, telling everybody what we were going to be doing with the NFL, and including this big announcement about the launch of a new technological advancement for the NFL. And I had to go to Steve just before the press conference and said, we can't announce it, we're not ready. And for anybody that knows Steve, there's 3 words that come out of his mouth, usually in sequence. You can figure out what those are. And he goes, well, we got to announce something. So I had to come out and say, in addition to all the things that we've talked about, we have a major technological advancement that we're going to show you in about 3 weeks. And that was it. And it was totally buffaloed, and we got through it. But it was one of those like total smoke and mirrors jobs, and thankfully nobody really asked us about it, and they did. We can't tell you, it's very secret, and we lived another day.
I should have said at the beginning, if anybody has questions,
Yeah,
we're happy
please.
to dive in anything people have ever wondered about it. So just raise your hand or indicate. Happy to do that. Yeah.
Was it always yellow, or was there a thought about what color? Like how did that work?
It was interesting. The engineers, of course, have no clue. So when we first got it to working, we had it so you could have it be pretty much any color you wanted. And some engineering-like folks would say, well, it needs to be orange because the marks on the sideline are orange. But almost everybody, when they saw yellow, they said, that's got to be it. And I think Jed was the one who finally nailed that decision, and Jed picked the exact shade of yellow, which was perfect.
What's the Pantone?
Actually, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to talk about it. But Jed worked with JR
Yeah.
in the truck in real time, saying, a little bit brighter, a little bit darker, this, that. And when he saw the color, he said, that's it. Rip the knobs off. That's the color.
And then Jed also had us do a soft alpha so that it was slightly transparent, so you could see the leaves of the grass through it. And that's no longer done that way, but you could see the leaves of the grass through it, and it really did look like it was chalk on the grass.
Yeah.
It was a very cool approach.
And so we launched it. It was September 27th, 1998 in Baltimore, Ravens and Bengals. And the response immediately was enthusiastic. I mean, all the reviews were good. And we sort of heard second and third hand that the production meetings at the 3 networks that had turned us down were not happy meetings that Monday morning after that Sunday night game. But one thing that unfolded, which turned out to be an interesting drama, was that when we negotiated with ESPN, and it was Jed and I that really worked out the agreement, ESPN wanted an exclusive that first season, which we agreed to. But even though they had no postseason games, they wanted an exclusive through the playoffs, which, as any good lawyer, negotiator, CEO, I said, well, that's a ridiculous provision because you have no postseason games. But they insisted on it because they wanted that exclusive right through the entire season. And as a startup company that had opened its doors 6 months earlier compared to ESPN, I had about as much leverage as, I'm not even going to use the analogy. And so we had to agree, which came back to haunt us because when it became such a hit, Fox, which had the Super Bowl that year, wanted us to do the line for them. And as you can imagine, as a startup company in its first year with a chance to do this new technology for the Super Bowl, that was pretty attractive. And we made offers to ESPN to release us from that. But Jed, I don't know if you remember how that unfolded.
Oh, yeah. I think the figure was $100,000, if I'm not mistaken. And I think we said we were okay on the playoffs, and then at the last minute, I said, "Just throw in the Super Bowl." And you said, okay. Because little known secret, I mean, you were a startup company. We basically funded the whole project, so we did have all the leverage. And you came and asked, can we release this? And of course, I got to bounce it up to Bornstein. And then Bornstein had to bounce it up to Eisner. And at that point, then there were conversations at that level, and whatever conversations ensued internally between Michael Eisner and everybody else and their perception of Fox, we'll just leave it at that, because I had no idea what was being said. It came back down to us, and the answer was no. And so that was the last Super Bowl. So that would have been the Super Bowl in end of January, early February 1999, the last Super Bowl that did not have 1st and 10. And it was simply because we had some leverage.
I think it was hell no, is my recollection.
Yeah, that's pretty
Something
accurate.
like that.
Yeah, it was, although, as anybody who's been involved in a startup company knows, and all the highs and lows, I can still remember exactly where I was the night I got the phone call from Steve Bornstein telling me it was going to be hell no, we're not making it available for Fox. So I still remember that moment, and it was, I mean, the rest is history, of course, but it was one of those things that really I don't think anybody ever knew about. I mean, Fox went on and did the Super Bowl, and it was fine. By the next year, we were doing it for everyone, but that was a big blow. Any other questions? Yep.
So you're a startup and you have a total of maybe 4 possible clients. What was your business model?
Well, I'll give you a very short version. I mean, we had a lot of different product options on our development list. We didn't limit it to a first down line for football. However, that line turned out to be a very profitable product because there were 250 NFL games and there were 1,000 college games, and so there was a lot of opportunity to extend it. But it was obviously not just limited to a yellow line for football for NFL broadcasts. Yeah.
This is my wife, by the way. This is
Our plans.
I'm sorry, that's the son. We actually just.
Honestly, you
Yeah.
have to answer honestly.
I will. It was actually right after we started dating, so I have bare memories of this. But what other technological hurdles did you have to overcome? Because if I remember, there was something about the stability of the cameras and the mathematics you have to do and the crowd noise once you get a little excited in the stands.
That's a really interesting question, and that wasn't a big problem for NFL, but it became a really big problem when we went and I did ICAA and college games, because the stadiums weren't as rigidly built, and the fans were all trained to stomp in time to the college music, and so then the cameras would bounce. And we measured the camera attitude very accurately relative to the tripod, but the tripod's bouncing, so now the yellow line is bouncing in tune with the fans that are stomping in the stands. So we had to put fiber optic gyros on the tripods to measure the bouncing so that we could bounce the yellow line, because the video was bouncing and we had to bounce the yellow line to correspond to it. So that was an example of kind of a problem that we had no idea we were going to face. But fortunately, we had a great, diverse technical team, and as it happened, I was on the board of directors of a company that built fiber optic gyros, so we were able to get them in a huge hurry and bounce the line to correspond to the bounce. And we asked, would you like us to stabilize the video? And no, let the video bounce, but we need the line to go with it.
Stan, do you remember when we first even went to the NFL? To anchor the tripods, we actually ended up drilling into the concrete of the stadium and running these chains with turnbuckles to hold them exactly in the right place. The looks we would get from the stadium managers, from the team executives that were out there with drills and pry bars, and we're drilling into their stadium, right? and sinking this hardware in. And they would look at us and go, really? You really do need to do that, right? Yes, trust us, we do.
Well, one last point that I know a lot of people have asked about over the years, and I don't know, Stan or Jeb, maybe you want to dive into this, is the keying. I mean, being able to make it look as though that line were painted on the field. And I just remember when we would be in stadiums, like domed stadiums or something, it would almost seem like it was easy. And then you'd go to a game that was a 4 o'clock game and shadows were moving and the Jets or the Packers or the Eagles with their green jerseys were part of the team, and it was a bear.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest situations would have been in Candlestick early on, where it's still got the baseball infield, and which is brown, and then the trousers, the pants are brown, and then it's just rained and it's drying, and then there's part sun and part shade. So now you have like 5 different colors of brown that we're trying to key over, but we don't want to key over the pants. And it was really, really brutal. On the other hand, you'd go to an indoor stadium where nobody's wearing a green uniform, and the keying system was, set at once. So, but when it was hard, it was really hard. But again, J.R. Glaudemann's, the system that he came up with was fabulously flexible, and we were able to work on snow, and we were able to work in these really difficult situations where we had green jerseys, or where we had 6 different colors of brown on the field and 1 color of brown on the pants. It was really interesting.
Well, I just want to conclude by saying, as the business person, it was an incredible privilege to work with 3 brilliant minds like the people sitting next to me. And really, it was the work that they put in that broke this new ground and obviously opened up the door to so many things that we see today. And again, thanks to Sportico for hosting us, inviting us here, and allowing us to have a great reunion in a week that meant a whole lot to us 25 years ago. So thanks
Thank
all.
you.